Some struggles shape us, others define our purpose. Those are the themes we explore in this episode of No Wrong Choices, featuring the licensed clinical social worker and therapist, Andrew Chiodo. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Larry Samuels, soon to be joined by my collaborators Tushar Saxena and Larry Shea. Before we kick off, please be sure to support us by liking, following, or subscribing to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Now let's get started. Tushar Saxena, please lead us in.
Thanks, Sam. You know, when you're dealing with the human mind, it's a very, very complex thing, right? It's kind of cliche to say that almost, but the kind of person who wants to treat that kind of illness, they have to be very special because you've got to be very patient, I guess, for one. But I think there are so many other factors that come into play, and I'm very interested in hearing Andrew's story about this because when we did our own research, we saw that he went from essentially going from the administrative side of things to a more of a clinician, and then kind of combining these two aspects into his life and then finally into what we see today. So, obviously his whole life story has been what led him up to this moment, and I'm very, very interested in learning more of that. What about you, Shay?
Yeah, I agree, Tushar. I think you hit on all the notes there. Just doing our research, you could really tell how his life is going to shape his career journey. And I think that's an important part of his story. I think we're looking for an insightful discussion about a career that just isn't for everyone. It's not just a job where you're clocking in and out. You're really trying to help people with problems, serious problems that most of us face every day. And, you got to put your heart and soul into work like that. It's not just show up to work, end of the day, you forget about it. This is a job that I would think would stick with you. And I think that's part of what our discussion should be, is how do you manage all of that, right? So, yeah, excited to get started. I think this is going to be a very, very interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Well, with no further ado, here is Andrew Chiodo. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Larry. It's a delight to be here with you, and I'm happy to share the stories and the arc of the career.
Why don't you set the stage for us and just tell us, in your own words, who is Andrew Chiodo and what do you do?
So as of today, and since 2008, I'm a psychotherapist, licensed clinical social worker in private practice in the Flatiron District, wherein I treat individuals, couples, families, and adolescents for a variety of psychiatric disorders, ranging from depression and anxiety to ADHD, bulimia, gambling addictions, and some alcohol and drug addictions. That's been an outgrowth of many years of being in hospitals, and what preceded that, which got me into the work, is a whole other story, which we can get to. But that's been the primary practice for 17 years privately.
Wow.
Privately.
Got it.
All right, so let's begin at the beginning. Were you always a kid who wanted to help people? Did you feel that you were built to do? Were you built to be a caretaker, so to speak?
Well, I grew up in a sliver of Brooklyn called Dyker Heights, which was a very insular Southern Italian community, an immigrant community. I'm a second-generation Italian American. And I grew up in a very Catholic, cohesive, insular neighborhood, which was, for better or worse, in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s, very protected by the mafia and very intense. And so it was very Catholic. We went to church every Sunday. And in my household, the drill was, there was Jesus Christ, there was the Pope, and there was Frank Sinatra. That's really
not necessarily in that order.
That was it. Like, you genuflected at Francis Albert, and you were good. But from a very early age, I would say 6 or 7, I understood that I was different. And by that, I mean, I understood that I had an attraction to men, but I couldn't, it's not something you verbalize, it's unconscious. And so as a result of that, I started to sort of pull back because I understood it was dangerous. I don't know how I understood it, but I did. And I calibrated my movements, my behavior to the environment. And so I was very sensitive. I was a really sensitive kid, but perceptive, and understood that if I make a wrong move or if I'm too something, I could get my ass kicked. And that happened on occasion, as it did to many other kids in the neighborhood. And so I understood how to navigate a neighborhood that was very complicated and very kind of intense, because our parents were raised by immigrants and they had one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world. They wanted us to assimilate. And so going to Catholic school from grades 1 through 8 was intense and hard. And I understood that when it came time to go to high school, my parents said, "Do you want to go to Catholic school?" And I said, "No." So they put me in New Utrecht High School in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, where I quickly gravitated to the school's literary magazine and became the editor and started to dabble with writing and words. And I was a kid who was always had his head in a book or his face in a book, or I'd go to the Bleecker Street Cinema in those days and watch foreign movies. And I wanted to meet guys at 15 or 16. And
Wow.
so I knew it wasn't going to happen in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, or Dyker Heights. And so um, I ventured in beginning junior year of high school. I was in the city every weekend. I was at museums. I wound up working in Red Hook in those days, which was very rough, and at a paper company, and met a fellow of mine, a friend, and he was about 6 years older. And soon enough, in my late adolescence, like 16, 17, 18, I found myself it was post Stonewall, it was hedonistic, it was fluid, and I found myself at underground gay discos and Studio 54, and I was doing all sorts of stuff I shouldn't have been doing, but I did it, and it was an education, and it was a lot of fun.
I want to ask you just real quick. I need to interject because that's such a huge part of the layers of the onion that are you, basically. How did that affect you, kind of hiding that aspect of your life for your entire childhood and only letting it out in certain areas? I mean, that must have had a profound effect on you in terms of how you navigated the world.
I learned how to compartmentalize very quickly and to show parts of myself to some people and not to others. How to read a room very quickly, how to deflect with humor, how to please people so that they would not get too close to me, so that they would know. Now, that was there. When I got to New York and started to really develop a community, I busted out and was, ready. And so I met my first partner in 1983, and we were fortunate to have we had a great setup on Perry Street in the Village, and we had a floor through brownstone, and it was a good relationship. And we both were writers, and I started writing fiction. I wrote for a literary magazine called Christopher Street, which at that time was the literary magazine of the day for gay people, and also for the New York Native, which was a newspaper. And I did restaurant reviews and theater reviews. But at the same time that was happening, there started to become rumors in the community that this strange gay cancer was happening, and nobody knew anything. And Ronald Reagan had just been ushered into the White House along with the religious right. And all of a sudden, everything went from a big party to a big hangover. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves at the sides of our friends at hospital beds, at clinics. I was giving eulogies, and this is not an exaggeration. I think I was giving eulogies every quarter for somebody. So 4, 5, 6 a year. And so virtually all our friends passed. And
Wow.
so we couldn't fathom what was happening. So we mobilized and joined ACT UP, which at that time was run by Larry Kramer, who founded the Gay Men's Health Crisis. And so we did die-ins and we did all sorts of stunts with the stock exchange. And we went to Washington and we marched and we laid down in streets. And I dealt with families who were throwing their kids out of their houses. And these kids men didn't have anything, anywhere to go. And we watched robust, healthy 20-something and 30-something men, architects, lawyers, doctors, designers, robust guys in the prime of their life shrink to what looks like sort of what you see in The Sorrow and the Pity in concentration camps. And so it was a profound, the 80s were transformative in that way. And we were doing social work without knowing we were doing social work.
Yeah.
Right.
We just did it. We rolled up our sleeves, men and women, and got to work. And by 1989, I decided, I'm doing this, and my writing wasn't making money, and I figured I got to
Meaning being an advocate and being a voice for
being a voice, being an advocate, advocating for people in hospitals so that their partners could be at their sides, and the doctors some were great, some were not. So we were doing a lot of social work, and I decided I should just go do this. And so I went and got accepted into Hunter College School of Social Work on 77th Street. And that was a great fit because it was very community organized. It wasn't so clinical as it was grassroots.
Yeah.
In
terms of the program that you entered into?
Yeah,
Or
in
the
terms of
school?
the program, in terms
Okay.
of, and the school was very, like, you couldn't say at Hunter that you wanted to do private practice. And I didn't want to do it at the time, but you couldn't say that because then you would be like, I don't know, looked not so well upon. So if you
Ostracized, really?
yeah, not ostracized, but if you wanted to do community organizing and you wanted
Right.
to do advocacy, it was very sort of strike oriented and very right up my alley. Whereas NYU and Fordham were very clinical and great, but clinical. So graduated in 92 and then got a job luckily, a plum job at Mount Sinai in their
Before we explore that, I'm curious. You went into the program, and with everything that you had gone through up until that point, what was your vision? Like you knew you wanted to focus and do something, I guess, more structured around what you were already doing. But did you have a vision for how you were going to make an impact on the other side of school?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if at the time I had a strong vision, but I saw myself as advocating for the marginalized and um, the downtrodden. I don't know what the right word is, for people who didn't have a voice, and I felt very strongly and committed to this population, and that's where I segued into Sinai, where I worked with severely and persistently mentally ill patients who were underprivileged, and very ill. And in that setting, I learned, because it's a medical model setting in the hospital, we attended rounds, there was medication groups. There was a lot of, we dealt with very sick schizophrenics, bipolar patients, personality disordered patients every day. And so it was trial by fire in the trenches. I didn't know I was going to land there. When I was in school, I had no idea I'd wind up in a psych program, but I did, and I took to it. And I learned a lot. And I had a great mentor who was Elaine Hobson was her name, and she was all of 5'2" and had hair down to her ankles and was bottomlessly compassionate and terrifyingly strong. And I wanted that, I wanted to inhabit that world. And so it was a great experience from 94 to 2000.
I want to step back just a little bit and talk to you about and ask you about your career getting into it, as to how your family reacted to it. And then, I mean, maybe does that maybe coincide a bit with when did you come out to your parents
Mhm.
about being gay? And then when you obviously you were treating those, as you say, who are on the marginalized, on the outs of not the but the fringes of society, so to speak, at that point.
Sure.
How did they accept your career choice?
Well, they were really good actually about the writing as well as the social work. They were high school graduates, middle class people who worked very hard to put their kids through school. They were, it's a funny story. When I came out to my parents, they were confused and befuddled. And the only thing they knew how to do was go to a priest and say, priest, my son just came out to me and I don't know what to do. And they must have gotten a gay priest because the priest said, do you love your son? And my mother and father said, of course we love our son. And they said, well, then that's all you need to know.
Yep.
That's a great answer.
How old
That's a
were-
great
how old
answer.
were you?
Yeah.
I was 22.
Okay.
So
And
you were in school. You were in school at this point,
I
right?
was in school at this point. I was dating women, but not dating women. I had beards. I didn't have beards. It was, again, it was all fluid, but they, in 6 months, they were great. Like they were,
That's great.
and I was very fortunate because I watched kids come out in Brooklyn and they got the crap beat out of them by their
I mean,
parents.
I can imagine growing up in such an insular community, hardcore Catholic, as you say, for them to be very, cool about it is great.
Yeah, I was very lucky, and they were very impressed, if I can use that word, with my choice of career and what I was doing because they were FDR Democrats and
Sure.
they believed in, helping others and uh, being there for people. And they were Christian, they were really Christian people in the best sense of that word. So they were very supportive. I have one older brother who was also very supportive. So fortunately, no complaints there. And they were very welcoming of my partners, and and just very humane about the whole thing. So I was very fortunate, and that allowed me, I think, to feel good about what I was doing.
So, that's not always the case that a family supports, especially during that era and where you come from, the background, etc. So, that is a good thing. So you're at Hunter College for social work, and how long a program is that? How long are you going to be there? And, I guess why were you thinking about private practice at time? You said at that time you said you didn't really say that out loud, but is it in the back of your mind that you want to do private practice, or are you still just all about the community and I'm just gonna fall in line here for a minute?
So it's a 2-year program at Hunter College, and you do you have 2 days of classwork and 3 days of internship. And what I was doing was doing that, and then I was supporting myself through from 5 to 12. I'd go to school. 5 to 12, I was word processing, if you recall that term, at law. Uh,
I
I
had
still
a
have. I
brother
still
word
have mine. I still have
processor
mine
in
somewhere. Yeah.
undergrad. I vividly remember that.
So I was working with high-end attorneys at law firms and just, sort of proofreading, word processing, getting out at midnight, uh, going home, or sometimes going to the Odeon for a burger and uh, doing the same thing for 2 years. And so it was in the back of my mind that I wanted to do private practice, but I also knew that that was way down the line because I knew I needed to get real training because I really didn't know what I was doing. I knew how to care for people. I knew how to be empathic, but I didn't have tools in my toolkit yet. And it was only at Sinai when I learned how to do what we call psychodynamic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, excuse me, that I started to feel like I could start to really treat people in a real way. And Sinai gave that to me in spades, like they were great. Um, and still in 2000, I was recruited by Cabrini Medical Center to run their psychiatric day treatment program. Ironically, it's the hospital where my father was born, so I had a certain affinity for it. It was called Christopher Columbus Hospital in the 20s. And so I ran that program. And during that time, that was very interesting because 9/11 happened. And, I can tell you an anecdote that's funny and not funny about 9/11 because at that time, I was supervising psychiatry residents, social work interns, non-clinical staff and clinical staff because I was wearing a clinical hat and an administrative hat. I was responsible for all the clinicians as well as the audits from regulatory agencies that gave us our accreditation. So I sort of learned how to be a half a lawyer and a full-time clinician. And I was supervising a social work intern on the morning of 9/11 at about 8:45 before anything had happened. And I didn't know, in those days, right, we only got our news from radio or TV. And so I'm talking to this social work intern and reading her notes, and we're talking. And the policy at Cabrini was if a patient was going to be absent, they had to call me and they had to tell me why, because I had to assess, is somebody suicidal, is somebody not feeling well, blah, blah, blah. So a patient calls me and says, Andrew, I'm not coming into work today because a plane has hit the World Trade Center. And I said, okay, I'm going to call you back because I was in the middle of something. And I said, are you okay? And she said, yeah, I'm okay. I said, okay, fine. So I turn to the intern and I say, and I relate what I just heard, and I say, so, this is somebody who's not necessarily medication compliant, and sometimes they can lapse into psychoses. And this sounds like a psychotic episode.
Yeah.
The phone rings 3 minutes later, it's my boss, and he says, get up here right now. We got a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Bingo. So now we have to sort of contain 30 psych patients who we're all traumatized, right? All of us are traumatized, and manage them, manage us, manage the staff, and figure out what to do because we're all waiting for people to come in and sort of all hands on deck. Nobody's coming in to the ER or anybody, as we know.
Right.
So that was kind of a moment at Cabrini that was very intense. A bookend to that, which is nicer, is that one of the things we did at Cabrini, wherein we had very many talented patients, they did artwork, which we had framed, and we turned the whole center into a gallery. And
Oh, nice.
it was really great, and invited the hospital to come in and purchase. And there was beautiful artwork. And so people purchased. It was great PR for our program. And I think the patients donated the monies to a 9/11 fund.
Obviously, as you said, you wore two hats, administrative and clinical. Was there ever a point in your career where you said, I want to go one way or the other? Because, I mean, these, as a social worker, I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, these really are only kind of the two paths that you can go, and so many go the administrative route. What is the biggest difference? And then in your case, what made you want to go one way or the other?
Well, I liked both ways because the clinical allowed me to be with people and to train and to be in the human section of it, and the administrative piece satisfied my closet OCD, which you have to dot your I's, cross your T's, make sure your chart notes are right, get your performance improvement numbers up, and so I'm wired for that. And so it was a welcome relief for me to step away from clinical stuff and focus in on charts. I know that sounds really dry, but
That's okay.
I,
It's you.
um, I,
I'm the exact opposite. Detail does not exist in my universe.
exactly. So it was a way I guess it was a way I coped, but I felt I could master it. Like I could get my arms around it. You can't always get your arms around people and their pathology, but you could around a chart note. And we always got like the top, not to toot my own horn, but we always got the top accreditation. We always came in with flying colors. My staff was always great and they were wonderful. So it was a really good, to answer the question, a really good combination that worked both from a human place and I don't know, paperwork place, and kept me sane a little bit. But it meant going in on weekends and looking at charts and, it was a lot of work.
All right. So, what is the biggest difference then between an administrative social worker and a clinical social worker? Outside of the paperwork portion of it.
So that's a good question because in the hospital system, especially at North General, they wanted numbers. They wanted us to get patients in. They would double book patients. I didn't agree with this, but I did it. They would double book patients. They were all about getting the funds. And I had to really balance the clinicians because the clinicians were like, why are they double booking us? And inevitably, when you double book somebody, the truth is only one person shows.
Right.
You book one person, you don't get a client, you don't get money. And so you don't make income, you don't make revenue that way. And so that's the biggest difference, was trying to bridge the understanding that we needed to get financing and revenue and provide good clinical care. And those things can be at odds with each other. And that was hard, because sometimes two people would show up and somebody would have to wait. The clinician would be stressed. Were they doing their best work knowing they had somebody right outside waiting to come in? It was hard. That would be the biggest difference. And hospitals have to do that. And for better or worse, and I'm not proud of this, but Cabrini and North General both, and St. Vincent's, all went under. They're no longer hospitals in New York City. And they went under because they were not administratively managed well.
So, Andrew, can you tell us when you made the decision that you were ready to go out on your own, so to speak, and start your own practice?
Sure. That was '08. 18 years after having worked in 3 hospitals that I felt confident enough to pull the plug on institutions and plug in the plug on private therapy.
And how do you do that? Do you hang a shingle? Do you place an ad? How do you get started?
Well, it helped me that my boss quit. My boss at North General quit, and I didn't want to work for anybody else. So I thought, I'm out. And I was already starting a private practice part-time in the evenings. And then I used my network from Sinai, Cabrini, North General, had a lot of psychiatrist friends, a lot of social worker friends. And I used that word of mouth and my network to build a practice, which took me a good 7 years before I was at 45 patients a week. And I'm at about 35, and that's a good number for me.
So this question kind of goes without saying that this field isn't for everybody, right? It takes a very, I think, special person to be a therapist. But I have to ask this question jokingly, but not really jokingly. How sick do you get of listening to people's problems all day long? Because that's not for everybody, right? It takes, like you said, some real empathy and some real care and some real understanding to, day after day, you have your own problems. You're dealing with somebody else's. It's a lot.
Yeah, I think in the beginning it's really, really, really hard because it's an untrained muscle. So if you think of it like going to the gym and working a certain muscle that gets stronger and stronger and stronger, over the years, I can sit down now, um, and it's the rare occasion that I get a really boring patient, although I've had them. And uh,
What qualifies as a boring patient?
Good question, T. Good question. Problems are rudimentary.
it's a good question. Um, People who are, I have to be delicate here. People who are repetitive and sort of bring in the same problem every week, every week, every week without really listening. And you have to know when to intervene. So someone can come into the office at a first meeting, and usually nowadays I can see what the path is for them. But I'm not going to say that. I have to wait and I have to be patient and I have to know when are they ready to hear this? When are they ready to hear that they're acting like their mother, who they complained to me about for the last 6 months?
I'd assume that's what. To me, that seems like the essence of the boring patient, right?
And so it just requires, and I think this is where karate and meditation helped me be very patient. Um, it's it's the work. It's like anything. It's like you go to work and you're a lawyer. There are things about being a lawyer that are not so interesting, but you have to do them and you learn how to do them. Um, and how does a therapist separate his problems, right? Because I've gone through parental deaths, deaths of friends, my own sort of personal challenges. How do I do that while I'm sitting in front of somebody who's also, telling me their stuff? Um, in a way, it's kind of easier to listen to somebody else and shelve your own problems and then come back to them later in the day. 'Cause it really does prevent you from ruminating about your own worries, because you have to pay attention. And so that was always harder in the first half of my career and much less hard in the second half.
I'm wondering about the first part of your career as a young therapist. How do you get comfortable? Meaning, I imagine there's a lot of pressure on you to learn your craft. I mean, if you screw up, I can't imagine what those consequences could potentially be. Like, how do you get comfortable? And what are those emotions early on?
You have to tolerate, you have to be able to tolerate a lot of discomfort in the work. It's essential. You can't take things personally, and you have to be okay with screwing up, and you have to own it. And I've screwed up, and I've said to patients, I'm sorry, that was the wrong thing to say. So I apologize. And if you do that, you're home free. Because patients always know, it's my experience at least, and especially with very sick patients, they always know when you're lying or not telling the truth.
Wow.
They always know.
Obviously, your clients unburden themselves with problems to you, and you work through it. That's got to be a lot for any therapist, for you, for anybody else. So, who do you speak to? Do therapists need therapists?
In the beginning, absolutely. In the beginning, I was seeing you have a number of different things. I was blessed with a very good supervisor who I met weekly. B, we had group supervision. C, I had an outside group I would meet with of therapists to talk about cases. Um, and I had my own, I would journal or keep a track record of my notes. But you have to have people around to talk to. You can't do this work in isolation. It's a mistake. Um, you have to be able to talk about what's being evoked in you by clients. As clients evoke a lot of feelings.
How should a patient go about choosing a therapist that will work
Good
for
question.
them?
They should interview at least 3. First and foremost, you're a consumer, you're looking for a therapist, you should interview people. You should assess the energy in the room itself and feel like, is this person really listening to me? Are they getting me? I had a patient recently come in and said to me, my wife thinks I should be in therapy. I said, all right. Why? And he said, well, I have problems communicating. And after I went to AI to look for interventions, I thought I'd come to you.
Wow.
And I said, well, how did AI help? And they said, well, AI, and we can segue into this for a second. AI was very pragmatic and cognitive behaviorally oriented. I said, so why are you here? He said, well, I think I need a human touch. I said, okay, we can work with that. He said, I've interviewed 3 other people. And he said, I think I'm going to pick you. I said, well, lucky me. 'Cause I was
You over AI.
You
want to
over
check
the
with AI
machine.
once more. And so we're working together, and he's a great guy. But like that's how you do it, right? Like you're a consumer. You should just buy into anybody because there are a lot of kooks out there.
All right, so I want to kind of touch on this word that you've used a lot about working together, right? Obviously, as a therapist, your idea is to listen to your patient and then give them feedback. How much of the word work is on the onus of the patient themselves to work through their problem? And what does that mean for a patient to have to work on their issues?
So it's always a collaboration between therapist and patient because the patient does it with the assistance of the therapist, but it is ultimately the patient's will and motivation to change that is essential for a successful outcome.
You use will and motivation. Is there any notion of, let's say, responsibility involved in that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As a responsibility, accountability, um, and I think I do this well if I can say like I do hold people's feet to the fire about what they say they're going to do and what they don't do. And for people with real mental illness, now I'm not talking about like I had a fight with my girlfriend or um, my boss yelled at me and I can't deal with it. People with real serious mental illness, I'll often say, listen, this isn't your fault, but it's your responsibility. It's not your fault that you have bipolar disorder, that you have severe clinical depression, but it is your responsibility to manage it.
I'm curious, and this is where I was going to head next. How has your practice, how has your approach changed? I mean, you've been at this respectfully, for a while. You're a very experienced guy, and you've seen the world flip upside down in the time that you've been practicing with the introduction in some ways of the internet and then social media and mobile phones and everything else. How has that impacted how you treat patients and your day to day?
It has impacted it greatly. Like young men and women in their 20s and 30s who are trying to date and are using dating apps, when they talk to me about how they use dating apps, it sounds like they're shopping for patio furniture.
Wow.
I'm swiping up. Oh, Harvard. No, I don't want the Harvard guy. No, no, no. Columbia. No. I want state schools. I'm like, what? Like it's surreal. It's like it's a whole new, and this is where I sound older. It is a whole new field of pathology, because now you have parents who want to check it. You know, their parents who were in their 30s, raised with phones, they want to check out too. So now they're not parenting in the way they ought to be parenting, and they're giving their kids screens to babysit them. And so now the whole household is dysregulated because not only are people getting different information, but they're living virtually versus living presently. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're living virtually. That's a big change. One that has been a little daunting for me because I have a very modest, I think, healthy relationship to the phone. It's an instrument to be used for practical reasons for me, but I don't engage so much in social media. But I truly feel for the kids growing up that this is the tip of the epidemic right now. But we're headed into something very isolationist where kids are in their bedroom with the door closed, doing God knows what on their phone.
Let's try something fun. I was trying to think of some good movies that had therapists in them, like a Dr. Melfi with The Sopranos, or maybe you see yourself in one of these people, or Richard Dreyfuss in What About Bob, right? One of my favorites, or Stutz. But bigger than that, there's a lot of documentaries and things on HBO, things of that nature, that are like literally open sessions, like in treatment and couples therapy, and you see it so open now on TV and in entertainment. I'm wondering if there's any benefit to that. Could you watch something like that and take something from it? Oh, I do a little bit of that. Or do you look at it and say, this is opening a can of worms that I'm not sure should be
voyeuristic,
open.
right?
I think it's a mixed bag. I'll tell you, in the 90s, we used The Sopranos. I taught family therapy vis-a-vis The Sopranos because it was so brilliantly written, so spot on, and so hilarious. And as an Italian American, I could relate to it in tenfold. And so it was hilarious and smart. That said, I've watched Shrinking with Harrison Ford.
That's great.
Adorable and completely unrealistic. And there's a couples therapy show, I'm not sure the name of it, where they...
Right. I think might even be called couples therapy, I think,
and
something like that.
For people who are thinking about therapy as a possibility, I don't think they can do, it's okay. I think they can do, it can be helpful. I've yet to see, apart maybe from Dr. Melfi, a truly, maybe Gabriel Byrne in treatment. He was pretty good. I have to give Barbara Streisand a thumbs down for The Prince of Tides.
Okay.
Loving her voice.
Fair.
Not the case. And I never saw What About Bob, so I can't.
Oh, I love that.
Gotta see that movie.
Love
You've
that
gotta
movie.
see that movie.
You gotta see that. Also interesting, Stutz with Jonah Hill. Jonah Hill has gone through a lot of mental issues, and he put his whole process on display with his therapist in like an 1.5-hour documentary. I mean, what do you think about something like that? I mean, I got a lot out of it, but
I haven't seen
wild.
it, and I will see it now after this conversation. So I'll tell you, the movie that I saw most recently, while it didn't have a psychiatrist in it, but was loaded with psychiatric and psychological overtones, was a movie called All of Us Strangers with the Irish actor, they're both Irish, Andrew Scott and Paul Mescal. If you have an opportunity, it's a beautiful rendering of a man who tries to reckon with his past and goes back in time and has imaginary conversations with his parents. That if you're not a mess after that 90 minutes, there's something with you.
Right.
You need seek therapy, right? What about a film like Silver Linings Playbook? I mean, I don't want to have you review every movie that's involving therapy or therapist.
That Bradley Cooper did a great job of portraying a bipolar patient. He was terrific.
I fell asleep at it twice.
Really?
I never got through it. I saw it once in the
That's
theater.
a good movie. I like that
sound
movie a lot.
asleep.
I loved it. I loved it.
It's kind of my go-to feel-good movie when I'm a little down.
Yeah.
I thought it was okay, but that's just a personal opinion. Streisand also did a film called Nuts, which was also terrible.
Right.
She should strike out on that front. But I guess the earliest one was like, now I'm dating myself, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, well, classic of classics, absolutely.
Of course.
Jack Nicholson, which
course.
was pretty good. Wonderful film. But yeah, no, I think it's a mixed bag, like because you have to be in the room. Like it's hard to recreate. The Sopranos did a really good job of, she was amazing.
So Andrew, as we move towards the end, we always ask our guests for advice. So somebody who would like to follow in your footsteps and become a therapist, what advice do you have for them as they get started on this career path?
To know why they're doing it. You often hear people say, I went into therapy they won't say it, but you can surmise that people go into therapy to fix their own problems. That's not a reason to be a therapist. You should know oneself and you should know why you want to do this. You should know yourself in a way, well, in the old days and in the new days, I would just say you should have a good course of treatment yourself before you entertain the idea of becoming a therapist.
That's great advice.
You should really understand why you want to do this, because somebody's putting their mental health in your hands. You better really take it seriously.
Andrew, this has really been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. So that was Andrew Chiodo with an incredibly powerful story about purpose and really finding your purpose. Larry Shea, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, this is not a profession for the faint of heart, I would say. You really have to enjoy helping people and really love to dig into the nitty-gritty of what makes people tick. We all have problems. We all need people like this to work out those problems. But it takes a special person, I think, to really dig into it. And so you could feel that love when he's talking about his profession. I took so much out of it. Know why you're doing it, know oneself, and have a good course of treatment for yourself. T, I think you asked, do therapists need therapists?
Yeah.
It's a valid thing, You could really tell how his younger life kind of shaped his career journey, and he talked about it as well. He said, he appreciates that he found a career path that fit who he was. And that's something to remember with whatever career path you're taking, Make sure that it fits your personality. Make sure it fits who you are. And there was also an interesting thing that he talked about with, he needed the detail-oriented work of the administrative side because it kind of handled his closet OCD, which I found interesting. And then the clinical stuff allowed him to be with people and train, because you could tell by the way he talks, he needs people. He's a people person. So I took so much out of this. It was a really insightful discussion.
The one thing or a few things I took away from this is that my mother is a retired psychologist, and yes, absolutely. The one thing he said, much what you said, go into this profession with your eyes open. But I think the other part of that was understand what it is you want to get out of this profession as well, right? You're not going to go into it with an idea that I'm going to heal myself through my patients. That's not going to happen, and that's not your job either, right? As you said, Shay, is that this is not a job for everyone. Not everyone should be doing this. But I think the one thing that I really took away from this was, when everyone goes to the doctor at some point in their life, right? Whether it be, your internist, your orthopedist or whatever. But in a lot of cases, it's a kind of a clumsy example, but it's like going to a mechanic, right? You say, hey, my when I raise my arm like this hurts, or I'm coughing and have this problem, and can you fix it? Now, for the most part, those doctors say, okay, take this pill, or we have to do this, this X-ray, and they can find a problem. That's not always the case in this profession, right? You are responsible for putting in a lot of the work that is going to make you well, and it could take a long time, right? Yeah, we can go to physical therapy and work out aches and pains, but for the most part, we know what's going to happen at the end of that journey. This is not always the case. We hope that we find a reasonable end to whatever the problem is, but the reality is that it is a real process, and you are responsible for making yourself well as the person who is treating you. That was a really, really telling statement, and it gave me greater insight into what my own mother did for so many years, and that's what I really took away from speaking with Andrew. He's a great guy, and he obviously loves his patients, and you know what? He goes out of his way to try and make his patients better, which is a key for any healthcare giver.
Absolutely. And I think for me, what I'll walk away with, aside from all of that, is kind of how he wound up where he is. He's somebody who spent a lot of time exploring his own world and his own life, and discovering and figuring out who he is and how he wanted to express himself. And to then get caught up with the AIDS movement in the 80s and the 90s and the impact that had upon him, to find a way to turn all of that around and to focus his passions and to really make a difference and to create a life around his love for others made a huge impact upon me. And, I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to talk to Andrew today. I took away so much from that conversation. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. For anybody out there who'd like to learn more about Andrew, you can visit his website at andrewchiodo.com. Once again, he is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist based here in New York City. We also thank you for joining us. If this episode made you think of someone who could be a great guest, please send us a note through the contact page of our website at NoWrongChoices.com. While you're there, please check out our blog for a deeper look into each of our guests and episodes. As mentioned at the start, don't forget to like and follow us on your favorite podcast platform and to connect with us on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and X. Your support helps us to keep bringing these incredible stories to life. On behalf of Larry Shea, Tushar Saxena, and me, Larry Samuels, thank you again for joining us. We'll be back next week with another inspiring episode of No Wrong Choices.